Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and tonight we're celebrating the master of melodrama, director Douglas Sirk, with his incredibly powerful 1954 film, Magnificent Obsession, starring Jane Wyman and Rock Hudson. Not to be confused with All That Heaven Allows, also directed by Douglas Sirk, starring Jane Wyman and Rock Hudson. Joining us tonight is a prolific film historian and writer. She is the author of the book, The Essential Directors from Turner Classic Movies. Please welcome Sloan DeForest. How are you doing tonight, Sloan?
Hi, great to be here, Ryan. I'm well, thank you.
Sure. What was your earliest exposure to Magnificent Obsession?
Well, I actually saw this movie when I was a kid. It was the first Douglas Sirk movie I ever saw. By the way, I'm wearing bright red in homage to
Of
Douglas,
course.
of
Yeah.
course, because his films were so colorful. And I was about 13 years old, and I stayed home sick from school one day. And I happened to catch a broadcast of Magnificent Obsession on a local Dallas-Fort Worth station. I'm from the area. Hi, Dallas-Fort Worth. And so I didn't know at the time it was a Douglas Sirk movie. I didn't know who Douglas Sirk was. I was just 13 and I just turned this movie on and I thought, oh, here's a corny old 1950s melodrama I can just kind of poke fun at. Like that was my initial response. I was going to kind of laugh at its datedness, I guess. But pretty quickly the joke was on me because it hooked me in, it drew me in against my will, into this story. It was so just the emotions and the spiritual element of it. I don't know, it all just drew me in, the characters. And of course I was very young. I was the right age to fall for it. I was just, still a kid really, and this was the late 1980s. But I think even more sophisticated audiences today can relate to this. It's like it's a very heightened melodrama, of course, with a kind of improbable, actually kind of preposterous plot, and this musical score that's like a chorus of heavenly angels. And your first temptation may be to kind of roll your eyes and laugh at its sentimentalism. But, there are two different approaches to take with this movie. I think the cynical view, to come into it cynically and kind of write it off as a cheesy 50s melodrama, or the open-minded approach to get genuinely invested in the characters, to and allow yourself to really be touched by it. And I strongly recommend the second approach. If you meet the movie halfway and watch it with an open heart, it can be a really powerful, emotional, and inspiring experience, which I attribute to the acting of Jane Wyman and Rock Hudson and the direction of Douglas Sirk mainly.
Now, as a student of filmmaking and directors in particular, what are the hallmarks of a Douglas Sirk film?
Well, Douglas Sirk actually started, in the 40s in Hollywood. He came here in the 30s. So there are some 1940s black and white Douglas Sirk films like Lured with Lucille Ball, which I really like, from 1947. That's a good one. But, it wasn't until Magnificent Obsession in 1954 when he really became the Douglas Sirk that we know and love, the master of melodrama. And that kicked off, as I say, in 54 with Magnificent Obsession, followed quickly by All That Heaven Allows. Then we had Written on the Wind and Imitation of Life. Those four are kind of the biggies. Also, The Tarnished Angels was in there with Rock Hudson, which is a really good movie. That's black and white though. If you're talking about the master of melodrama, Douglas Sirk, it's really those four big ones. The hallmarks of those are his use of very bright colors and deliberate colors. Each color kind of has a meaning. He put a lot of thought into the color, whether it symbolizes a character or the emotion or something about the scene. And again, the heightened drama, which I don't know if people today are used to, but I think they enjoy it when they get into it, because I think we're so used to this kind of lackadaisical, almost lazy, low-key acting and storytelling style that I think we think of as more realistic. Well, his films were not that kind of realistic at all. Everything was over the top and the emotions were full blown, full throttle. But it was great because the emotional power was real. It wasn't phony. Like it was sincere. But there was also, with Douglas Sirk, you get that a little bit of an undercurrent of kind of subversive, maybe tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of a social commentary, or a winking nod to the audience that we're aware that this is heightened melodrama, and we're playing with it. We're having a little bit of fun with it too.
And when you really think about it, movies are make believe, they're fantasy. We want to be transported to faraway lands, and we don't want
Exactly.
to just go and see a documentary. And I think this is such a beautiful example of what Hollywood was capable of in the studio system, in Hollywood's golden age. And Douglas Sirk is certainly a master at what he does.
Yes, I agree. That's that irony, that ironic wink that I think sometimes people today maybe make a little too much out of, though. I think that there's an interpretation of like, oh, it was all done with this great irony, and it was so symbolic of the repression of the 50s. And I mean, at the end of the day, he was making crowd-pleasing tearjerkers. That's what he was doing, and he was doing it really well. But because he was German, I think maybe, and had a different sensibility, he went into it with a little bit of an outsider's view on his look at American culture in the 50s. So that's what gives it that extra layer.
Certainly. For anyone seeing Magnificent Obsession for the first time, what do they have to look forward to?
Well, they have to look forward to Rock Hudson's first starring role. This is the big thing. Now, Jane Wyman is terrific in the movie. She was a great actress. Not to take anything away from her. She was an Oscar-winning actress for Johnny Belinda in 1948, and she was nominated for another Oscar for her performance in Magnificent Obsession. She's great in the film, but Rock Hudson, in his first starring role ever, just nails it. It's kind of incredible to see this character transformation as Bob Merrick. It's not an easy role to pull off. It's multi-layered, a lot of evolution, and he really does a spectacular job. And Agnes Moorehead, everyone in the film is spot on perfect. The story is something that, again, maybe audiences are yearning for a little bit more than they realize. It's a spiritual story. It's not, even if you're not Christian or religious, it really kind of grabs you. It's the philosophy. There's a philosophy behind the film. It's not just a love story or a melodrama or a tragedy. There's a lot of hope and inspiration to be had.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Sloan, so much for your time. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the movie so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from director Douglas Sirk, the 1954 version of Magnificent Obsession. Oh, wow. I think I got something in my eye
Sure.
after seeing that. Maybe someone's cutting onions. I don't know what it is, but this movie
Yeah.
always has an impact on me when I watch it.
Yes, it's the movie. I know. I'm already tearing up thinking about it.
So this is quite a fascinating film. You kind of alluded to this earlier. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a faith-based film, but if you watch the trailers, it says, based on the novel by Lloyd C. Douglas, who was the author of the Robe, of course, the great biblical epic with Victor Mature and Richard Burton, made I guess the previous year. So what was the origin of the story? How did it come about?
Well, as you said, it was written by the Reverend Lloyd C. Douglas. It was his first novel, published in 1929. He was not a professional writer, and I think the critics observed that, that he was not, the book maybe was not the greatest written novel in the world, but it was a huge success. It was very popular. That led to him writing other books, as you mentioned, The Robe, which was the other one that got turned into a big film, of course. But the Magnificent Obsession kind of caught on as a book, as a phenomenon, and then it was made by Universal as the first film version in 1935 with Irene Dunne and Robert Taylor.
How did you see the 1935 version of Magnificent Obsession?
Well, I got really lucky because the movie was unavailable for viewing anywhere for decades. And so I always wanted to see it. So when I was working at Universal Studios Hollywood, when I first moved out here 15 years ago, 2008, they had an employee screening on the lot of classics from the Universal Vault, and they happened to screen Magnificent Obsession for the employees when I worked there for like the 6 weeks I worked there. So I got to see it at Universal, gorgeous prints. Beautiful movie with And again, that was Robert Taylor's first starring role, similar to Rock Hudson in the 1954 version. It made him a star. But again, as I say, that movie just wasn't seen for years. So what happened was Jane Wyman was a big fan of the book, if you fast forward to the early 50s, and she wanted to star in an updated version of Magnificent Obsession. So it all started with Jane Wyman. Ross Hunter was a producer who made the deal with Jane Wyman, and he wanted Douglas Sirk to direct. And he wanted Rock Hudson as the co-star, who he was trying to turn into a star. So it all came together. The only hitch in the plan was Douglas Sirk at first. He didn't like the story. He had never seen by the way, the 1935 version directed by also the previous master of women's melodrama, John M. Stahl. And so Cirk had never seen the Stahl version of 35, didn't want to see it, never did see it, couldn't read the book, couldn't get through it, didn't like it at first. And then he read a treatment, I guess, that Ross Hunter had written of the overall story. And he thought, okay, with Jane Wyman in it, maybe this could work. He started to see it. And then he said, love it and hate it. He became obsessed, appropriately, with Magnificent Obsession, with bringing it to the screen. And that's how it all started.
And the film certainly came out masterful. Now, I do appreciate how you're giving a shout out to the performance of Rock Hudson, who I always felt to be an incredibly underrated actor. I always thought he had a lot of charisma. He was always very likable. I love him in such movies as, All That Heaven Allows, Giant, so many amazing classic films. But I feel like he's just not appreciated as an actor today in the way that he should be.
I feel like he's never been appreciated as an actor, even back in his day or today. Yeah, as much as he should be, because he was so tall and gorgeous. He was such a hunk. And at first, he had to learn to act. Maybe his first few roles weren't that dynamic, but that's half of Hollywood, please.
Yeah.
So once he got there, and once he really, once he arrived. And I think he was always underrated because of his looks, like they do with gorgeous women. Marilyn Monroe's another example.
Oh yeah, no, certainly, certainly. I'm trying to think, but no. So you mentioned the original master of women's melodrama, John M. Stahl. It's kind of fascinating when you look at his career trajectory. You look at his filmography. He also directed the 1934 version of Imitation of Life, which of course Douglas Sirk would famously remake in 1959. And even watch a movie like Leave Her to Heaven with Gene Tierney and Cornel Wilde. And that also feels, it's a much darker, grimmer film that I think Magnificent Obsession is. Certainly, but I feel like you see his use of colors and composition. It does remind me a lot of Douglas Sirk.
Yes, I know. It's interesting that Cirk was not a Stahl fan because John Stahl is kind of the proto Douglas Sirk in a way. I think you're right. I can see that for sure. Leave Her to Heaven is one of my all-time favorites, and that use of Technicolor in the woman's melodrama, it's a film noir, but it's also a woman's picture. It's a femme
Right.
is what I call it. But yeah, John Stahl also interestingly made Backstreet in 1932, which Ross Hunter, the producer of all of these sort of Cirque films, remade again in 1962 with Susan Hayward. By then, Douglas Sirk was out of the country. He retired after Magnificent Obsession and just retired to Switzerland and left Hollywood entirely forever. But if he had been around, you could imagine he might have directed even a third remake of a John Stahl film.
Maybe. You said he retired after Magnificent Obsession,
No,
or
after Imitation of Life
okay, sure,
in
yeah.
59. Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned Ross Hunter. In a lot of ways, would you say he's the mastermind, or do you feel like it was really Douglas Sirk's vision that made these movies so visually distinct? Like, who would you give more of the credit to?
I think it was Douglas Sirk for sure, because, Ross Hunter did a lot of other films, but they don't have that Sirk touch, and Backstreet, it doesn't have the Sirk brilliance to it, just that je ne sais quoi is missing that. I don't know if you've ever seen that version of Backstreet with John Gavin and Susan Hayward. It is heightened melodrama. It is epic. It is a long, lavish color remake of a 30s melodrama, but it lacks something. It lacks Douglas Sirk. He was the man that had this I don't know, he had this way with that kind of melodramatic material that he was very deft in his hands. And he added, as we said, a lot of context and maybe some irony to it. And just his camera work too. I mean, you know, you're gonna see or you have seen if you've just watched Magnificent Obsession, and in All That Heaven Allows and all of his 50s films. It's really beautiful the way, you know, he has, like, I hate it that people call these movies soap operas because I think it's so unfair. Calling them women's pictures is okay. I mean, to me, that doesn't bother me because they were, you know, they were made more with a female audience in mind. Men saw them too, but they were women's pictures essentially. Fine, but don't call them soap operas because a soap opera is a 3-camera videotape TV show that cannot compare with the gorgeous, you know, blocking and fluid camera work and inventive shots that Douglas Sirk brought to the table. Here's one thing I love about this movie. Okay. If I don't care if you're gay, straight, male, female, whatever. If Rock Hudson in his prime takes your hand and says, "Let me be your eyes." I mean, who wouldn't melt? That's just, that's pretty good. You know, that's just like, I mean, if any of us, God forbid, were stricken blind tomorrow, I think that gesture would just make life worth living. It really has a, it's not just Rock Hudson being gorgeous Rock Hudson, but it's this spiritual aspect, as I mentioned, to the film. It really, you know, it reminds me a little of Pay It Forward. There was a book and a movie in the year 2000 that was kind of popular called Pay It Forward, and I think it was a little bit inspired by this. And this film also has inspired, I mean, Martin Scorsese, Catherine Bigelow, Quentin Tarantino. It's even a favorite of Tarantino's, you know, so a lot of modern day directors have found inspiration in this film.
Sloan DeForest, honestly, it's been a pleasure talking. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ryan. Glad to be here.
All right, if you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film as much as we did. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.